This was a horrific crime. To be able to do that to someone would require some level of anger and hatred towards this individual.
It's more easy to assume that a man is probably perhaps more capable of committing this kind of savagery. And so talk with the female who may be an unwitting ride along and see if she might crack.
Keep walking, stop.
What happened in the house? Who's covered?
She describes him as being homicidal, and she describes herself as just basically being gripped with fear as this is all unfolding.
I don't get scared much, but look in his eyes scared. Yeah.
She claims she becomes kind of a victim in this thing. He did the exact same thing. He started to point more toward her as being the problem. He said she's the one that wanted to murder. She was the mastermind.
She made the comment of taking her out. I was still kind of like panic mode and we're trying not to panic.
Both people are clearly involved, but you know, how much of what he says is the truth, how much of what she says is the truth.
I love you, babe.
Love you too.
It was a toxic combination that was fueled by sex and power and a desire to live a freestyle life at the expense of another human being.
Why? Why was someone so mad at her?
There's love in her.
On the evening of January 4th, 2022, police in Tulsa, Oklahoma receive a call from a worried employee at a towing company after 29-year-old Sarah McGuire misses her shift.
She was very reliable in showing up. She had consistent shifts that she was working, and so when her supervisor realized that she's not here today, that obviously set off alarm bells.
She's calling and asking the police department, hey, can you do a welfare check? And this is just not like her. So the police are called out.
They were looking through windows, trying to see if they could see anyone. They were able to see kind of through a hole in the blinds. There was someone on the couch. They were covered up with a blanket.
Obviously, at that point, it's like, yeah, we need to get in there. Something maybe amiss here. Maybe she's ill. Maybe she's sick.
They noticed that the front door is locked.
And so law enforcement breach the window and get through and unlock the door.
When the police department make it inside the home, they go into the room where they've seen what they believe is a person laying there on the couch. Almost the entire portion of that person's body is covered by a blanket. That blanket towards the head has blood on it. When they remove that blanket, they see this woman with gash marks and blood all over her face. Blood matted in her hair. The injuries were quite severe.
It was quite obvious in this scene that she was dead. When we're dealing with the body, even if we know who's supposed to be living there, we just don't make the assumption that the victim is then that person, especially in this case where severe damage was done to the face and everything. So we'll use secondary, and that could be anything from scars, marks, tattoos. In this case, there was some very distinguishable tattoos.
Police took some photographs of some of her tattoos and were able to find out family members' information, contact information. They were able to confirm that that was Sarah McGuire. This was a horrific crime. To be able to do that to someone would require some level of anger and hatred towards this individual. Why did Sarah have to die?
Sarah Elizabeth McGuire grew up in the small town of Apache, Oklahoma.
We grew up a farm family, my mom, my dad, and there were 4 of us kids. I was the oldest. My sister Lindsay was next, and then my sister Sarah, and then our little brother Seth. My parents worked a lot, so we grew up a tight-knit group of siblings. My parents got divorced whenever I was 15, so Sarah would have been 10 and a half, 11. And my dad ended up remarrying 2 years later.
In 2007, 3 years after her father remarried, Sarah decided she needed a change.
Sarah moved to Tulsa in her sophomore year of high school. My mom, Kim, and my sister Lindsay already lived in Tulsa. Sarah had still been living with my dad and stepmother. She decided she wanted to move with our mom, so we moved her up there. It was a really good transition for her.
After high school, Sarah struggled to choose her next steps, but she eventually landed a job where she was thriving.
She was working for Speedy's Towing in Tulsa, Catoosa area, and she was the office manager there. Sarah was the central hub of that workplace. Sarah had such a all-encompassing love and protective nature for people, family, friends. She was one of those people that could be friends with anybody.
We met at a mutual friend's house, and then we just started hanging out, like, all the time. She was really bubbly, funny, charismatic. She would do anything for anyone. If she saw somebody that wanted money, she would give them the last dollar that she had to make sure that they had something.
At this point in her life, she was doing so well. She had a full-time job. She was flourishing.
She was doing great. She was super excited about the things that she was pursuing in life and where she was going. And we were all proud of that.
A lot of the murders here in Tulsa are shootings, some stabbings. This was way more than that.
It was obvious that the cause of death was some type of blunt trauma injury to her head. There's blood spatter on the walls, on the ceiling.
They can see on the blanket that there's a fairly sizable pool of blood, at least on the blanket itself. Underneath the couch, kind of on the floor, there's an even larger pool of blood. There were no signs of forced entry. The front door had been locked. There was some food left on the counter, some pork chops that a couple had been eaten off of. There was some mac and cheese. The circumstances of the home suggested whoever did this had some kind of connection to Sarah. They knew her in some way.
This isn't a scene where somebody came in there who was a stranger to Sarah. You have some sense that whoever was in that house had permission to be in the house and took some care to secure the house when they left. You know, it didn't look like any signs of a struggle. It looked like just an ambush. Why would she be killed in such a manner? The next logical question is, where's her wallet or her purse? Where are her credit cards? You know, is anything here that should be here?
She didn't have her wallet there. Even her phone was gone. No credit cards.
Based on the severity of the violence, detectives know the motive isn't as simple as a robbery gone wrong.
When you look at her injuries, clearly this was fueled by some emotion and some anger or jealousy towards Sarah.
There's no doubt it's personal. There is passion, there is hate, there is aggression.
As detectives continue processing the scene, they collect a crucial piece of evidence.
You have this wrecking bar sitting neatly right on top of a dresser, just conspicuously laying there. Obviously looks like it's been cleaned up or washed up.
To have the crowbar sitting there, right there in the room, just really a couple feet away from Sarah, on seeing those injuries to her face, I think it's a very reasonable and logical conclusion to make that this is more than likely the weapon that was used.
While forensic investigators document the scene, detectives take their search outside the home.
We will canvass the area to see if anybody saw anything unusual, any kind of cars in the neighborhood or anything like that.
Nothing really stood out to any neighbors that would lead them to think that something this horrific had happened just a couple houses away. In speaking with neighbors, officers had learned that Sarah had a white Dodge Charger.
She drives this 2012 white Charger, and it's not where she parks. Let's get the tag, let's get a good description on that Charger, and then let's be on the lookout as a possibly stolen car, so that if you're in law enforcement, you run across this type of car with an Oklahoma tag, we're looking for it.
And so, do we have someone associated with this killing on the run? Time is of the essence.
Coming up, Sarah's family alerts police to a troubling relationship in her past.
It became more and more toxic. It was a really bad situation.
And investigators track down Sarah's stolen car.
He actually saw the Charger sitting in the parking lot.
They see there's two people sleeping in it, a male and a female.
Hours into the murder investigation of 29-year-old Sarah McGuire, Tulsa police are desperate for any clues into who might have beaten her to death inside her own home.
So the logical step, obviously, is you got to reach out to family, give them a death notification, and then have a very hard conversation with them right at the exact same time.
That personal contact is one of the first places we're always going to look. Who does she associate with? Who has she had problems with?
My mom called me. She lives in Bartlesville, and she was wailing like nothing I've ever heard before. She said, "There's cops at my house, Tulsa cops." She said, something happened to Sarah. And she just said, "Sarah's dead." I just felt like my whole world stopped. I never, in my wildest dreams, imagined that anything like this could have ever happened to Sarah.
This family was in shock. They wanted justice for their sister, their daughter.
Tulsa police, as they're speaking with Sarah's family, trying to figure out who she knows, who might have been in her home, they learned Sarah had been in an on and off again relationship with a man named Walter Spradlin.
Sarah began dating Walter, I would say probably 6 years ago. They started off seeming to be a very good relationship. As the relationship progressed, it became more and more toxic, and I know drugs were involved. And Sarah, this is where her loving nature became a flaw. Our family told her that several times, that you can't fix everybody. You can't fix him, and you can't make this right. You have to take care of yourself. And she didn't see it like that. Sarah and Walter had broken up officially. I believe maybe a year and a half they had been apart.
That would be definitely something we'd want to go and check and talk to Walter.
So they go out and find him and talk with him.
They let him know what had happened to Sarah. I think from his reaction, he was pretty surprised to hear the news.
When we do an investigation like this and we go and we talk to an ex-boyfriend, we want them to tell us where they were, what they were doing, what kind of relationship they had with the person.
He told those officers, "I haven't been with her. I've been home with my family."
Walter denied having any involvement with this case and said that he was home with his mother at the time.
Detectives immediately follow up with Walter's mother to verify his alibi.
His mother confirmed that he had been at the home with her all night and hadn't left. Other family was able to confirm that, and ultimately he was ruled out as a suspect.
After eliminating Walter, detectives reach back out to Sarah's family about her missing credit cards.
Detectives asked her family, "Can you try and contact the bank and see if you can figure out if any of her information has been used to try to purchase anything?"
My mom and Sarah had a joint account. In case Sarah ever needed money, my mom would just put money into that account. And somebody was trying to use Sarah's debit card.
The family eagerly tells detectives that Sarah's card is still in use and moving quickly.
They clearly spotted a trail moving through Oklahoma, up into Missouri a little bit, and then back into Arkansas. They had stopped in a Walmart and took money from the ATM card, did Cash App purchases, did several things.
And that's a huge lead to the case because it gives you a location and a timeline. It's literally like little breadcrumbs left along a path.
As detectives review the activity, they're notified of a new charge from a few minutes earlier.
The last purchase they made was online food order at Whataburger in Fayetteville, Arkansas. So we contacted the Fayetteville Police Department.
They say, hey, we have a homicide that took place in Tulsa. We're looking for a 2012 white Charger.
So they asked some of our patrol officers just to kind of go to the area and see if maybe they couldn't locate the vehicle.
At around 11 a.m., Fayetteville police arrive on the scene of the Whataburger restaurant.
The first officer that got there was one of our motor officers who rides a motorcycle. And so as he pulled in to the area, he actually saw the Charger sitting in the parking lot.
It's still sitting in the parking lot, so now they know, all right, we better get on this. So then the Fayetteville Police Department brings more officers to that location and surround the car.
You're totally surrounded and there's nowhere to go.
It's been less than 24 hours since Sarah McGuire was found brutally murdered. And police have located her stolen car in Fayetteville, Arkansas, more than 100 miles away.
What Fayetteville knows right now is that this is a vehicle that's stolen. It's associated with a homicide, so the Fayetteville Police Department is going to take every precaution.
So once they had a really good plan in place, they started approaching the vehicle.
As they're approaching that vehicle, they see there's two people sleeping in it, a male and a female.
Officer, there's a white Dodge Charger in the Whataburger parking lot. Sit up, put your hands up. Let me see your hands. You're totally surrounded and there's nowhere to go. Stand up, face away from me.
Put your hands on top of your head, interlace your fingers, and don't look towards me.
Back seat passenger, exit the vehicle, stand up and face away.
Patrol officers called them out of the vehicle. They pretty much just followed every command that they were given and just got out of the car.
Keep walking, keep walking, keep walking, stop.
Once officers are able to extract these individuals from the car, they're trying to find out identifying information. They ask them, what are your names? And they voluntarily offer to them. One of the individuals is Nicholas Johnson, and then the other is Brentley Denison.
In a case like this where they find the suspects in the victim's vehicle, which has been identified as being stolen, they have enough probable cause to make an arrest.
I love you, babe. Love you too.
So Fayetteville Police Department take them to their police station.
After they were taken into custody, we essentially treated the vehicle like a crime scene. It was secured and towed to a secure lot here at our police department. We contacted Tulsa, let them know that they were under arrest. They told us that they had 2 detectives that were already on the way.
So Tulsa Police Department, TPD, gets over to Fayetteville to find out what, if anything, they know about the death of Sarah.
They decide to interview Brentley Denison first. Maybe they thought, hey, let's rule her out as maybe a possible victim in this scenario.
It's more easy to assume that a man is perhaps more capable of committing this kind of savagery. And so talk with the female who may be an unwitting ride along and see if she might crack.
We're homicide investigators, and we're here to talk to you about the car you guys were in.
She starts talking about, I knew Sarah, she's a friend of mine.
How did you guys meet?
My friends. Both He's my best friend.
Brinley explains that she and Sarah shared a mutual connection through Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Walter Spradlin.
It was learned that Walter introduced Brinley to Sarah.
Brinley was looking for a place to stay at that time, and Sarah offered up a place for her to stay. She offered up a shed that was in her backyard.
It was fairly small, it almost looked like a work shed.
How long have you been staying over there?
Probably 2 weeks. I don't know, maybe 3. Yeah.
Did you spend a lot of time in the house as well?
Yeah.
So she treated you right. She was good to you.
Yeah.
So a big question is, why did something like this happen?
To determine exactly what happened to Sarah and why, detectives switch gears and ask Brinley about her connection to Nick.
So how do you know Nick?
I don't know, for like a while.
When you say for a while?
Like, it's been years.
Brinley tells detectives that she's lived in Tulsa her entire life.
Brinley was born in Tulsa, 1996. Childhood was pretty normal. Mom, dad, sister. When me and her mom got a divorce, I think it had a big effect on her. She's 13, 14, and I'm at work. You know, she kind of is able to run wild. And then she gets pregnant in her senior year, drops out of school.
After her son was born, Brinley obtained her GED and went to beauty school.
She did graduate from the beauty school. She could have had a career in hair, but Brinley was, hanging out with the wrong people. And it just went downhill from there.
She was a heavy partier and all that. She had been in trouble with the law on several other occasions. She had a drug past.
Brinley was not working unless you want to say stealing from people is working. It was almost like a high for her. So Brinley was in jail for theft, and we get her out. She comes to my house. But the first night that I worked, she left, and we never saw her again.
She was in between homes, didn't really have anywhere else to go. So Sarah offered Brinley a place to live. Brinley had told detectives in her interview that, she had been in this on-again, off-again relationship with Nicholas Johnson.
Brinley surprises detectives when she explains that Nick is married with children.
Nicholas kind of has a similar storyline to tell about, growing up in kind of a fractured home.
He was born here in Tulsa. Nick grew up staying with his dad, but they would bounce around from wherever they could have a place to stay.
In July 2012, a 19-year-old Nick met his future wife, Stacy, while helping family members move into a new home.
I had rented this out to them, and that is how I met Nick. From day one, we've been inseparable. Several months later, we got married, and I ended up getting pregnant on our first kid. Now we have 5 girls and 1 boy.
When Nick met Brinley in 2019, however, he soon began staying away from home more often.
He had a drug problem, and he was doing, good with it. But I thought that maybe we got back into it.
He was very similar to Brinley in that he was involved in drugs, couldn't hold a job, was doing some kind of like part-time house remodeling.
After collecting details about their suspects, detectives ask Brinley about the last time she saw Sarah McGuire. But she suddenly becomes uncooperative.
And how did you guys get the car?
Yeah, I don't know where it's at.
She initially played stupid, I don't know what you're talking about.
Ultimately, as they continued to press her and ask her questions about what happened, she gave them her version or her story of events.
This is important. We didn't come all the way from Tulsa to talk to you about a stolen car, and you probably know that. Okay. What happened in the house? Just tell me why. Who got so mad at her? Why was someone so mad at her?
Brinley starts describing this story, and I certainly would call it a story because it's from her perspective to protect her skin.
"25-year-old Brinley Denison has started opening up to authorities about her complicated relationship with murder victim, 29-year-old Sarah McGuire."
Brinley had been living there for, I think, a couple of weeks or so, and they had begun to engage in a romantic relationship.
She'd always say, is she ain't gay? I'm like, I ain't gay either, We're both good guys or whatever. And she was just different. She was all I wanted. Everybody knew that. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that.
But Brinley had also been in an on-again, off-again relationship with Nicholas Johnson. And kind of where her relationship with Sarah began versus where that relationship with Nicholas ended is a bit murky.
Last time we talked, I broke up with him. There was a huge fight.
And you knew you were staying over with Sarah?
Yeah.
So the night of the murder, Brinley tells Tulsa police detectives that she and Sarah were hanging out in that main house area. Sarah had cooked her dinner, and then Nicholas Johnson shows up.
I didn't know he was coming.
Nicholas was in love with Brinley. He was going there to hopefully make up with Brinley.
Who invited him in the house?
Sarah did.
So when he came in, was it friendly?
Yeah.
Was it friendly for a while?
Yeah.
So where did it go from?
When did it go?
Where did it go bad?
The pictures.
Brinley says Nicholas had seen some photographs of Brinley and Sarah, maybe some scantily clad photographs that really upset him.
Were the pictures sexual in nature?
Yeah.
How did the pictures get seen?
They were in the room, and he went back there.
And so he saw these pictures. And did he think that that was a problem between you and him?
He knows.
Maybe he pissed at you or pissed at her?
Both. I don't get scared much. But look at these eyes scared.
She describes him as being homicidal in that he's in such a rage that he's going to kill Sarah. And so she flees to this back bedroom of Sarah's house, and she can just hear the homicide taking place, and she describes herself as just being gripped with fear as this is all unfolding.
Less than 10 seconds, but it felt like forever.
She getting hit with
a crowbar.
Sarah was laying on her couch. It doesn't give me any indication that she may have even been conscious at the time the first blow was delivered to her.
Brinley tells detectives the night's horrors were far from over.
So did you guys leave right then and there? Or
No. He forced himself on me first.
She claimed after he beat her, he then grabbed Brinley and took her into the bedroom and raped her. So now she becomes kind of a victim in this thing.
Brinley told detectives that the plan was that they would travel to Arkansas, to Devil's Den. And along the way, they needed to dump the clothes, get rid of some of this physical evidence that might be tying them to the murder. During this whole time, Brinley is telling detectives she was in fear for her life, and she was essentially hostage with Nicholas as he was doing all of these things. All of this behavior that happened while they're on the road, the multiple stops that were made, being left alone in the vehicle multiple times, that really stood out to detectives as this isn't adding up with your version of events. There were multiple times where, if Brinley wanted to leave, she could have left. So detectives went to go talk to Nicholas Johnson, see what he would tell them.
We know Sarah's dead. You know Sarah's dead. You were there when Sarah died. and you were in Sarah's car.
Well, what happened?
That you killed Sarah.
I didn't kill Sarah.
This is your God-given opportunity that we are here right now to talk to you about why things took place. There's 2 sides, 3 sides to every story, okay?
Surprisingly, he decided he wanted to start talking.
Did she piss you off? Did she say something? Did she steal from you?
No, it was more over love.
Over love over who?
Brittany.
Detectives are speaking with Nicholas Johnson after his ex-girlfriend Brinley Denison implicated him in the murder of Sarah McGuire.
Once Nick breaks down and acknowledges his involvement, Nick describes how it appears to him that the relationship that he had with Brinley was compromised because of his discovery of Brinley having some relationship with Sarah.
Sarah was trying to put a wedge between me and Brinley.
Did that make you jealous?
A little bit.
But contrary to what Brinley is describing about Nick's rage, he doesn't describe it as rage. His focus is he's trying to figure out how to rebuild the relationship with Brinley, a person that he's professing his love for.
He tells them, I went over there to try and talk with Brinley, see if we could work things out.
Her and Brinley were arguing. Having some sort of debate. I don't know what it was. It was like, when I come in, it was the tension was kind of high.
Nicholas tells detectives that he and Brinley stepped outside so she could get some air.
What was decided between you and Brinley?
That we was, she was glad and happy to see me, and that we was going to try to move forward in our relationship.
When the couple came back inside, Nicholas says Sarah was asleep on the couch.
Apparently, what Brinley tells me is she don't like Sarah either. Somehow we got on the topic of stealing her car and all that stuff. We were just going to take off, and then Brinley was make the comment of taking her out.
He and Brinley have this conversation of he's gonna kill Sarah, killing Sarah and stealing her stuff. And so ultimately that's what they decide to do.
Were you angry at Sarah when all this stuff went down because of the love you felt for Brinley?
Yeah, because initially I had felt like the issues that we were having, that Sarah had caused it.
Who went and got the weapon?
It was already in the house, there in the kitchen.
So who picked up the crowbar first?
Brinley had it, she came into the living room with it.
Brinley, according to Nick, is the one that actually hands him the wrecking bar and says, do it. If you want the relationship, then Sarah's the problem. Sarah needs to go.
And I was talking to Brinley, and honestly, after that, I really kind of just blacked out on it, like just kind of zoned out on the whole thing.
Nick tells police officers that after he beats Sarah, he and Brinley go to have sex, but this is consensual. And while this is going on, he's still able to hear Sarah in the background, making noises, kind of moving around.
The sick, twisted details of the two of them having sex in the victim's bed, admitting to being able to hear the victim struggling to live. If that doesn't give you chills and make you mad and angry, I don't know what does.
So, what did you guys take from the house when you guys left?
I didn't take anything personally. I was still kind of like in panic mode and trying not to panic. And she was going through stuff in the bedroom and putting stuff in the bags that we had, that she had made up, her purse and another bag that had some clothes in it.
How about her credit cards? Do you know where her credit cards are?
Brinley had all those. She was the one that she was more with the brains with the credit cards and stuff like that.
Nicholas did the exact same thing as Brinley. He started to point more towards Brinley as being the problem. She talked him into it. She's the one that wanted to murder Sarah. She's the one that wanted to take the car and the money and all that. She was the mastermind.
So the detectives are now trying to figure out, can we prove one or both of these stories?
Coming up, as prosecutors prepare for trial, evidence continues to mount against both suspects. But will it be enough to convict?
The defense had argued that we didn't have sufficient evidence.
Her case was remanded back to the preliminary hearing stage.
I was very disappointed. The questions started flooding in about why, just why.
Less than 30 hours into the murder investigation of Sarah McGuire, Brinley Denison and Nicholas Johnson have both told Tulsa police their version of what happened in the savage crime.
Brinley's version is she's the held hostage rape victim. Nick's version is she's the mastermind behind the idea of killing Sarah and was a willing participant. Both people are clearly involved, but, you know, how much of what Nick says is the truth, how much of what Brinley says is the truth.
When detectives analyze the couple's electronic trail following the murder, they discover that Brinley and Nicholas were caught on camera at one of their many stops.
It's obvious from some of the receipts that we are able to recover that Nick, he's obviously savvy enough from his life on the streets to know that he can take a phone, and did that to a Walmart and was able to sell that phone to acquire some cash.
Tulsa police were able to recover some surveillance footage showing they did stop at a Walmart.
We see that Nick had actually gone into the Walmart by himself to do this transaction. She remained in the car, and that kind of debunked the whole kidnapping. She would have had a chance to run away and flee and everything.
I believe he was in there for about 20 minutes, and in that point in time, she's in a public place. There are a number of individuals who she could have sought help from. She was not this victim that she tried to paint herself out to be.
When authorities dive deeper into Brinley and Nicholas's backgrounds, it only further supports the idea that Brinley was a lot more involved than she was letting on.
Nick's rap sheet doesn't jump out at you as anything remarkable. I mean, I think the most he had was maybe some prior possession of drugs, but you look at Brinley, and it's a rap sheet that just doesn't stop.
There was some, possession of drugs, some theft either of a credit card or unauthorized use of a credit card.
One of the things that stood out was she was involved in a vehicle theft, and it was an armed, vehicle theft. Here's somebody who is claiming that she was a victim, and yet her track record suggests that she's a whole lot more savvy with the criminal justice system than Nick was. She's not a victim in this case.
Brinley claims that she and Sarah were in a relationship, but outside of Brinley's statements, there was really not much that we could say, yes, that's true, or no, that's not. I do not believe any photograph of Brinley and Sarah was ever recovered.
On January 6th, Brinley Denison and Nicholas Johnson are both charged with first-degree murder and extradited to Tulsa, Oklahoma to stand trial.
I was so grateful that they had been found, and then just the questions started flooding in about why, just why.
My reaction to hearing the news of Brinley was shock more than anything. I couldn't believe it. It's definitely not the way she was raised.
Faced with a mountain of evidence, Nicholas Johnson decides to plead guilty to the charges.
Prosecutors were going to file the bill of particulars, which means seeking the death penalty against these two, and Nicholas decides to blind plead, basically meaning I'm going to plead guilty without a deal from prosecution, so the judge is up to him to sentence him to whatever he sees fit.
So he enters a blind plea to the crime of murder in the first degree and a blind plea to the crime of possession of a stolen vehicle.
He did that in May, and by July he was sentenced to life without parole and sent to prison.
The case against Brinley Denison is more complicated.
The defense had argued that based on the evidence, we didn't have sufficient evidence to prove that she was a principal in the death of Sarah. And the court bought off on that argument.
Her case was remanded back to the preliminary hearing stage, and they had a hearing where Nicholas testified. After that, the judge ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to show that she had committed the crime of first-degree murder.
So once first-degree murder is off the table for Brinley, she pleads guilty to accessory to murder and gets sent to prison for 20 years.
As far as Brinley's sentence, I was very disappointed.
I don't think justice was served. Personally, I think that they should have been given the death penalty.
Sarah's never going to be back. Sarah's never going to be able to hug her mom or her family members or sisters. These two had a very sick relationship. And I think independently we wouldn't have seen this, but the two of them acting together was a toxic combination that was fueled by drugs and sex and power.
They conspired to kill her, to steal her belongings, steal her credit cards, steal her phone, and ultimately see, what all can we get away with. I think that Sarah would still be here today if it weren't for the both of them coming together.
Sarah was only 29, and she had so much potential, so much drive that was just taken for no reason whatsoever.
I want people to remember Sarah for how big of a heart that she had. I felt it in my own life and the things she would do for me, and hearing stories from other people of the things she would do and how she would help them. She would always help somebody in need. I mourn the life that she should have had, and I want people to remember how amazing she was.
The first scream never reached the newspapers. It vanished into the warm California night, swallowed by quiet neighborhoods where unlocked windows, trimmed hedges, and glowing porch lights had become symbols of a confidence that no one imagined could be exploited. In the summer of 1976, the suburbs stretching across Sacramento County appeared to embody the American dream. Families settled into newly built homes, children rode bicycles until sunset, and residents believed that danger belonged somewhere else. That illusion ended not with a single spectacular crime, but with a pattern so calculated, so terrifying, that it slowly transformed ordinary streets into landscapes of suspicion. Long before investigators understood, they were hunting one of the most elusive serial offenders in American history. The community knew only one terrifying fact. Someone was entering homes at night, watching, waiting, and leaving behind victims whose lives would never be the same. The attacker seemed to arrive without warning and disappear without a trace, as if the darkness itself had learned to move. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. Neighbors began sleeping with lights on. Dogs barking after midnight suddenly sounded like alarms instead of background noise. Every unfamiliar car parked along the curb became a source of anxiety. Fear was no longer an emotion. It became a routine. Every sunset marked the beginning of another night that might change someone's life forever. At first, investigators believed they were confronting a series of isolated sexual assaults. Each crime scene carried disturbing similarities, yet nothing appeared definitive enough to prove a single offender was responsible. The intruder demonstrated remarkable patience. He often selected quiet residential neighborhoods, studying routines for days or even weeks before making his move. Victims later described the overwhelming sensation that the attacker already knew their homes better than they did. He seemed familiar with bedroom layouts, escape routes, fences, and backyards. Sometimes evidence suggested he had entered properties long before the attacks themselves, quietly opening windows, moving objects, or unlocking gates for a future return. Such behavior shattered the comforting belief that home represented absolute safety. The invasion began long before the front door opened. It began with surveillance, calculation, and an unsettling level of preparation that left detectives wondering whether they were facing an ordinary criminal or someone possessing unusual knowledge of police procedures and investigative methods. The crimes escalated with frightening speed. Victims consistently described an offender who displayed absolute control. He struck during the deepest hours of the night, using darkness and surprise as his greatest weapons. Families awakened to the blinding beam of a flashlight, confused for only a fraction of a second before realizing that a masked stranger stood inside their bedroom. Terror replaced sleep instantly. The attacker issued calm but unmistakable commands, threatening immediate violence if anyone resisted. Survivors later recalled that the psychological manipulation often proved as devastating as the physical attack itself. Every movement appeared rehearsed. Every decision suggested experience. He spoke little, yet each instruction reinforced one horrifying reality. He expected complete obedience because he believed he controlled every possible outcome. That confidence unnerved detectives as much as the brutality of the crimes. Criminals often made mistakes under pressure. This offender rarely appeared to panic at all. As reports accumulated throughout Sacramento County, investigators recognized a disturbing pattern. The offender frequently targeted couples, carefully neutralizing any possibility of resistance before carrying out prolonged assaults. Crime scene technicians documented footprints, impressions, discarded items, and fragments of physical evidence. Fingerprints yielded little. Witness descriptions varied, complicated by darkness, fear, and masks that concealed much of the attacker's appearance. Patrol officers increased neighborhood surveillance, while detectives organized task forces dedicated to identifying the unknown offender. Community meetings filled with frightened residents demanding answers that law enforcement simply could not provide. Newspapers coined names reflecting public anxiety, while television broadcasts urged citizens to lock doors, secure windows, and report suspicious activity immediately. Yet, despite heightened awareness, the attacks continued. Every successful escape strengthened the growing perception that the offender possessed an extraordinary ability to stay one step ahead. The psychological impact extended far beyond direct victims. Hardware stores reported soaring sales of locks, alarms, and outdoor lighting. Gun ownership increased dramatically as families searched desperately for ways to reclaim a sense of security. Parents established neighborhood watch groups, escorting children to school and avoiding evening walks that once seemed harmless. Couples developed elaborate bedtime routines, checking every window repeatedly before attempting to sleep. Police dispatch centers received overwhelming numbers of calls reporting unfamiliar noises, strangers walking through neighborhoods, or vehicles lingering too long near residential streets. Most reports proved harmless, yet every false alarm reflected a community living under relentless tension. The unknown offender had achieved something rarely accomplished by a single criminal. He had altered the daily behavior of thousands of people who had never even seen him. Inside investigative headquarters, detectives assembled enormous maps covered with colored pins marking every confirmed attack. Geographic patterns emerged, but no obvious explanation connected them. Officers worked exhausting hours reviewing reports, interviewing victims, comparing witness statements, and analyzing every available lead. Behavioral observations suggested intelligence, planning, and confidence. The offender demonstrated physical agility by crossing fences, navigating canals, and disappearing into darkness before responding officers could establish effective containment. Some investigators speculated he possessed military training. Others suspected experience in construction, security, or law enforcement because of his apparent familiarity with neighborhoods and tactical movement. None of these theories produced an identifiable suspect. Instead, each unanswered question deepened the mystery surrounding the man responsible for spreading fear across Northern California. The investigation unfolded during an era when forensic science lacked many tools considered routine today. DNA profiling did not yet exist. Digital databases capable of comparing evidence across jurisdictions remained decades away. Detectives relied heavily on witness interviews, physical evidence recoverable at crime scenes, surveillance operations, and traditional investigative instincts. Every lead demanded painstaking manual work. Information traveled more slowly between agencies, increasing the possibility that connections might remain unnoticed for months or even years. Despite these limitations, investigators displayed remarkable determination. They understood that every attack represented not merely another crime, but another opportunity to uncover the identity of a predator whose confidence appeared to grow with every successful escape. Meanwhile, the offender continued adapting. He altered routes, varied methods, and exploited predictable weaknesses in neighborhood security. Detectives noticed evidence suggesting that he monitored police responses carefully. Some attacks occurred despite increased patrol presence, implying either extraordinary luck or an unsettling awareness of law enforcement tactics. Residents whispered theories that sounded unbelievable yet increasingly plausible. Was the attacker listening to police scanners? Did he work within the criminal justice system? Was he an ordinary neighbor blending effortlessly into everyday life? Such speculation reflected desperation rather than evidence, but it illustrated how completely uncertainty had consumed public imagination. Anyone could become a suspect because no one could explain how the offender repeatedly vanished. Victim testimony revealed another deeply unsettling characteristic. Many survivors believed the offender had watched them long before the attacks occurred. Small incidents that once seemed insignificant suddenly appeared meaningful in retrospect. Missing household objects, unfamiliar footprints near fences, anonymous phone calls, strange noises outside windows, or bicycles left in unusual places. Individually, these events proved impossible to connect conclusively to the offender. Collectively, they painted a portrait of someone obsessed with preparation. The attacks did not begin when he entered the bedroom. They began days or weeks earlier through silent observation. This realization intensified public fear because surveillance could occur anywhere without immediate detection. People wondered how often they had unknowingly crossed paths with the man investigators desperately sought. News coverage amplified the growing panic. Headlines described escalating violence, elusive investigations, and frightened communities demanding action. Television reporters stood outside police headquarters, broadcasting updates that often contained more questions than answers. Every confirmed attack generated renewed criticism regarding public safety and investigative progress. Detectives faced extraordinary pressure while simultaneously confronting one of the most disciplined offenders they had ever encountered. Yet despite frustration, they refused to accept that the unknown assailant could remain invisible forever. Somewhere beyond the crime scenes existed a human being with routines, habits, employment, relationships, and vulnerabilities. The challenge lay in discovering which ordinary face concealed the extraordinary capacity for calculated violence. No one standing beneath those California streetlights in 1976 could have imagined how far this investigation would ultimately reach. They could not foresee that decades would pass before science evolved enough to reveal answers hidden within microscopic biological evidence carefully preserved by investigators who believed that someday technology might accomplish what determination alone could not. They knew only the immediate reality unfolding around them. Another family shattered, another neighborhood shaken, another sunrise arriving after a night filled with sirens, questions, and silence where certainty should have existed. Somewhere beyond the police barricades, beyond the television cameras, and beyond the reach of every search operation, the unidentified offender disappeared once again into ordinary life, leaving investigators chasing a shadow that seemed determined never to be caught. The investigation refused to stand still, even as every breakthrough seemed to dissolve into another dead end. detectives returned to neighborhoods already combed countless times, measuring fence lines, retracing escape routes, and reconstructing the final minutes of each attack with painstaking precision. They believed the offender was making choices that appeared random only on the surface. Beneath every crime lay a pattern waiting to be uncovered. Every residence shared subtle characteristics. Many backed onto open spaces, drainage canals, parks, or greenbelts that offered quick escape. The attacker rarely relied on chance. He selected environments where darkness, geography, and preparation combined to create an overwhelming advantage. While terrified families focused on stronger locks and brighter lights, investigators increasingly believed the man they pursued had already studied those defenses long before striking. Crime scene after crime scene revealed a chilling level of consistency. Items inside homes were disturbed in ways that suggested deliberate psychological manipulation rather than simple necessity. Drawers stood open, furniture had been moved, and personal belongings appeared rearranged without obvious purpose. Investigators began asking whether these actions were intended to confuse victims or whether they reflected rituals meaningful only to the offender himself. Behavioral analysts, still working with techniques far less sophisticated than modern profiling, debated whether the crimes demonstrated compulsion, fantasy, or calculated intimidation. Whatever the motivation, one fact became impossible to ignore. The offender seemed to derive power not merely from the assaults themselves, but from controlling every moment before, during, and after the crimes. Fear had become one of his primary weapons. Victim interviews grew increasingly important. Detectives understood that memory under extreme trauma could be fragmented, yet they also recognized that tiny details might eventually prove decisive. Survivors described hearing footsteps outside windows before attacks, unusual sounds on rooftops, or faint movements in nearby yards during previous evenings. Some remembered anonymous phone calls that ended without a word. Others recalled bicycles abandoned in strange locations or unfamiliar individuals lingering in parks for no apparent reason. None of these observations alone identified a suspect. Together, they reinforced a disturbing conclusion. The offender often conducted surveillance well before entering a home. He appeared willing to invest extraordinary time studying routines, identifying vulnerabilities, and learning exactly when families felt safest. As public anxiety intensified, law enforcement dramatically expanded patrol operations throughout Sacramento County. Officers cruised residential streets through the night, stopping suspicious vehicles and responding to an endless stream of emergency calls. Neighborhood watch groups flourished. Volunteers carried flashlights, radios, and whistles, convinced that community vigilance might succeed where traditional policing had struggled. Yet the unknown attacker adapted with alarming ease. Some nights passed quietly, encouraging hope that increased police presence had disrupted his activities. Then another attack shattered that optimism. Each new crime reminded investigators that they were confronting someone capable of changing tactics without abandoning his fundamental method. He appeared to observe police responses as carefully as he observed potential victims. Inside command centers, walls filled with photographs, maps, handwritten notes, and timelines connecting dozens of incidents. Detectives compared shoe impressions recovered from multiple scenes, examined fingerprints that failed to produce meaningful identifications, and cataloged every physical item collected during searches. The workload became staggering. Reports accumulated faster than they could be analyzed. Every detective recognized that overlooking a single detail might allow the offender to disappear permanently. Yet despite relentless effort, no suspect consistently matched the available evidence. Interviews generated rumors, speculation, and occasional false confessions, but none survived careful scrutiny. Public frustration gradually shifted toward disbelief. How could one individual repeatedly evade hundreds of investigators while committing crimes that dominated statewide headlines? The answer, investigators feared, lay partly in the offender's discipline. Unlike impulsive criminals driven by opportunity alone, this man demonstrated patience bordering on obsession. He frequently approached neighborhoods under cover of darkness, using vegetation, fences, and irrigation canals to remain unseen. Witnesses occasionally reported fleeting glimpses of a figure running through backyards or disappearing into fields, but darkness swallowed certainty before officers arrived. Search teams deployed dogs, helicopters, and perimeter units on multiple occasions, yet the suspect consistently escaped. Every failed containment operation strengthened the unsettling impression that he either anticipated police tactics or possessed remarkable instinct for avoiding capture. Detectives refused to assume supernatural ability, but they increasingly acknowledged they faced an adversary whose preparation rivaled their own. The media transformed the investigation into one of California's most closely watched criminal cases. Newspapers devoted front pages to the latest developments, publishing maps of attack locations and practical safety advice beside dramatic headlines describing a predator who seemed impossible to stop. Television broadcasts carried interviews with frightened residents whose voices reflected exhaustion more than anger. Entire communities adjusted their lifestyles around the possibility of another nighttime intrusion. Evening social gatherings ended earlier. Curtains remained closed. Motion lights illuminated quiet streets that had once depended only on moonlight. Parents checked bedrooms repeatedly before attempting to sleep themselves. Even those living miles from confirmed crime scenes found their sense of security quietly eroding under the weight of relentless coverage. Investigators also confronted a difficult reality seldom visible to the public. Each attack inflicted profound and lasting trauma on survivors whose identities deserved protection and dignity. Detectives worked carefully to gather evidence while minimizing additional harm, understanding that every interview required victims to revisit experiences no one should ever endure. Their courage became essential to the investigation. Through repeated conversations, small details emerged that helped establish behavioral patterns, timelines, and methods. Although memories naturally differed, remarkable consistencies appeared regarding the offender's planning, confidence, and ability to dominate chaotic situations. These similarities convinced even skeptical investigators that a single offender remained responsible for an expanding series of crimes. As months passed, another disturbing possibility entered investigative discussions. Could the offender eventually escalate beyond sexual violence? History offered troubling examples of criminals whose behavior intensified over time as confidence increased and fear of capture diminished. Supervisors quietly instructed detectives to examine unsolved violent crimes for possible connections while avoiding unnecessary public panic. At that stage, no one could predict the full trajectory of the investigation, but experienced investigators understood that patterns sometimes evolved in dangerous ways. Preventing future violence required identifying the offender before he adapted yet again. Unfortunately, adaptation appeared to be his greatest strength. Technology offered little immediate assistance. Laboratories examined fibers, fingerprints, show impressions, and biological evidence using the best scientific methods available during the late 1970s. Results excluded some suspects while failing to identify others. The biological samples collected at crime scenes held extraordinary importance, though investigators could not yet imagine precisely why. Carefully packaged and preserved according to contemporary standards, they remained silent witnesses waiting for scientific advances that would not exist for decades. At the time, detectives viewed them as valuable but limited pieces of evidence. Unknown to everyone involved, those preserved samples would eventually become the investigation's most powerful voice. Behind closed doors, task force meetings often stretched late into the night. Detectives challenged one another's assumptions, re-examined dismissed leads, and questioned whether their understanding of the offender remained incomplete. Some believed he lived within the affected neighborhoods. Others suspected he traveled significant distances. Certain investigators argued that his familiarity with police procedures hinted at professional experience, while colleagues urged caution against allowing speculation to replace evidence. Healthy disagreement became part of the investigative process. Every theory required testing against documented facts, and the documented facts remained frustratingly sparse when measured against the scale of the crimes. Outside police headquarters, ordinary Californians continued searching for reassurance that never fully arrived. Hardware stores struggled to keep security products in stock. Locksmiths worked overtime installing deadbolts and reinforced doors. Families rehearsed emergency plans that they prayed would never become necessary. Children noticed whispered conversations ending abruptly when they entered the room. Newspapers became daily reminders that another neighborhood, another family, another quiet street might become tomorrow's headline. Fear spread far beyond the immediate victims because the offender represented something larger than a single criminal. He embodied uncertainty itself, proving that even familiar places could conceal unimaginable danger. By the close of another exhausting season, investigators possessed more files, more evidence, and more determination than ever before. Yet the identity of the man responsible remained hidden behind an ordinary face somewhere in California. He had not outsmarted science forever. He had merely committed his crimes during an era when science had not yet caught up. Detectives could not know that the evidence they protected with such persistence would one day bridge the enormous gap between suspicion and certainty. For now, however, every unanswered question echoed through darkened neighborhoods where families still listened for unfamiliar footsteps beyond their windows, wondering whether the silence outside truly meant safety or whether it simply meant the predator was waiting once again. Long before the world knew the name Joseph James D'Angelo, he was simply another face in California. A neighbor, a husband, a father, a former police officer. Nothing about his outward appearance suggested that investigators searching for one of the most elusive serial offenders in American history would eventually arrive at his doorstep more than 4 decades after the first crimes. During the height of the investigation, however, his name existed nowhere inside the countless stacks of reports filling police offices across California. Detectives chased hundreds of suspects, interviewed thousands of witnesses, and examined every imaginable lead, while the man who would later become the center of one of history's most astonishing cold case breakthroughs continued living an ordinary public life. That contradiction would ultimately become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire case. The individual responsible for years of terror was never hiding in some distant country or remote wilderness. According to prosecutors, he remained within society, blending into everyday routines while investigators unknowingly searched in every direction except the one that mattered most. Born in 1945, Joseph James D'Angelo spent his early years in circumstances that have been examined extensively by historians, journalists, and criminal investigators since his arrest. Public records document periods of military service before he entered law enforcement during the 1970s. Those facts alone attracted enormous public attention after his identification because they appeared to explain, at least in part, how the offender demonstrated remarkable confidence navigating neighborhoods, avoiding detection, and reacting under pressure. Investigators had long debated whether the unknown offender possessed formal tactical training or unusual familiarity with police procedures. For decades, those discussions remained theories supported only by behavioral observations. They became dramatically more significant after authorities announced the identity of the suspect in 2018. Still, investigators have consistently cautioned that professional background alone never explains criminal behavior. Thousands of military veterans and police officers live honorable lives. The actions attributed to D'Angelo reflected individual choices, not characteristics shared by those professions. During the years when the attacks dominated headlines, D'Angelo worked ordinary jobs, interacted with neighbors, and gradually built the appearance of an unremarkable suburban existence. Publicly available court records and investigative reporting describe a life that, from the outside, often appeared routine. He married, raised children, maintained employment, and blended into communities where few people imagined they lived near the individual investigators desperately sought. This ordinary exterior became one of the case's greatest deceptions. Detectives repeatedly reminded the public that violent offenders frequently avoid attention by maintaining conventional appearances. Yet understanding that principle in theory proved very different from recognizing it in practice. Every neighborhood contains ordinary lives unfolding behind closed doors. Distinguishing genuine normalcy from carefully concealed violence remains among the greatest challenges in criminal investigation. As years turned into decades, the unknown offender accumulated multiple nicknames assigned by investigators and the media as separate crime series were gradually connected through forensic evidence and behavioral similarities. What initially appeared to involve different offenders operating in different regions eventually revealed a far more disturbing reality. Advances in forensic science, combined with careful comparison of preserved evidence, demonstrated that the same individual had been responsible for crimes extending across jurisdictions previously investigated independently. That realization fundamentally changed the scale of the investigation. Detectives no longer pursued separate mysteries. They confronted a single offender whose criminal history stretched across years and counties, leaving behind victims whose experiences had remained connected by invisible threads until science exposed the truth. Throughout those decades, Joseph James D'Angelo never publicly emerged as a central suspect. Law enforcement agencies developed extensive suspect lists containing individuals whose backgrounds, movements, or behavior warranted investigation. Many were eliminated through alibis, fingerprints, physical evidence, or other investigative methods available at the time. D'Angelo's name did not become the focus of public attention because investigators lacked the critical scientific tools that would later redefine cold case investigations around the world. Biological evidence recovered from crime scenes remained preserved with extraordinary care, waiting for technology that had not yet been invented. Those sealed evidence containers represented silent promises from one generation of investigators to the next. If science advanced far enough, the truth might someday become visible. By the early 21st century, forensic DNA profiling had already transformed countless criminal investigations. Yet this case still resisted solution because investigators possessed a DNA profile without a matching individual inside existing law enforcement databases. Traditional comparisons reached dead ends repeatedly. The biological evidence clearly belonged to the offender, but identifying its owner required a new investigative strategy. Rather than abandoning decades of work, investigators continued preserving evidence, reviewing files, and monitoring scientific developments capable of opening doors previously considered permanently closed. Patience became as important as persistence. Everything changed when investigators embraced investigative genetic genealogy, an emerging technique combining forensic DNA with publicly available genealogical information under appropriate legal procedures. Instead of asking whether the unknown DNA belonged directly to someone already documented in criminal databases, investigators asked a different question. Could distant biological relatives unknowingly provide clues leading toward the individual responsible? That shift transformed the investigation from a search for one person into a reconstruction of an extended family tree. Genealogists, forensic specialists, and experienced detectives collaborated carefully, narrowing possibilities through historical records, geographic information, ages, family relationships, and documented timelines. Months of meticulous work gradually reduced an enormous universe of possibilities into a remarkably small group of individuals. Among those names appeared Joseph James D'Angelo. Investigators immediately understood that identifying a possible suspect represented only the beginning. They required independent confirmation before making any arrest. Surveillance teams quietly monitored D'Angelo without alerting him that he had become the focus of renewed investigative attention. Detectives documented his routines while collecting discarded items abandoned in public locations, following established legal procedures. Those discarded materials contained biological evidence that could be compared directly with DNA preserved from decades-old crime scenes. The science was precise. Either the profiles would match or they would not. Years of investigation now depended upon laboratory analysis measured not in dramatic courtroom speeches or emotional confrontations, but in microscopic genetic markers invisible to the human eye. When forensic scientists completed the comparisons, the results fundamentally altered one of America's most famous cold case investigations. According to prosecutors, the DNA obtained from Joseph James D'Angelo matched biological evidence preserved from crimes committed decades earlier. After more than 40 years of unanswered questions, investigators finally possessed the evidence they had pursued across generations. Detectives who had begun their careers chasing an unidentified offender witnessed technology accomplish what had once seemed impossible. Others who had retired long before the breakthrough watched from home as news broadcasts announced developments many feared they would never see during their lifetimes. On April 24th, SIL 2018, law enforcement officers arrested Joseph James D'Angelo at his home in Citrus Heights, California. Images broadcast around the world showed an elderly man being escorted into custody. The contrast stunned the public. Many had imagined the mysterious predator as a figure permanently frozen in the terrifying years of the original crimes. Instead, they saw a 72-year-old retiree whose appearance reflected the passage of time rather than the violence investigators alleged he had committed decades earlier. Yet age did not erase evidence. It did not erase preserved forensic samples, documented investigations, or the memories carried by survivors and the families of those who never lived to witness the arrest. For victims, relatives, detectives, prosecutors, and entire communities, the arrest represented something larger than the identification of one suspect. It demonstrated that time alone cannot guarantee permanent escape from accountability. Evidence carefully protected across generations had survived long enough to meet scientific methods unimaginable when investigators first collected it. Detectives who had refused to discard seemingly impossible cases found validation for decades of perseverance. Cold case units throughout the United States examined the investigation closely, recognizing that the combination of preserved evidence and advancing forensic science could reshape countless unresolved cases. Yet even after the arrest, profound questions remained beyond the reach of forensic certainty. Investigators could establish identity through DNA. They could reconstruct timelines, compare evidence, and present charges supported by scientific analysis. But no laboratory could fully explain motive, internal thought processes, or the reasons one individual allegedly embarked upon years of calculated violence while maintaining the appearance of ordinary suburban life. Those unanswered psychological questions continue to fascinate criminologists and investigators alike. They serve as reminders that solving a case and fully understanding it are not always the same achievement. One delivers justice through evidence. The other seeks insight into darkness that may never be completely understood. For decades, investigators believed they were chasing a ghost. Every new lead dissolved into another dead end. Every promising suspect was eliminated. The evidence remained, but the man behind it seemed to have disappeared into history. Then, without a single eyewitness stepping forward or a forgotten confession emerging from the shadows, science reopened a case the calendar had nearly buried. Tiny fragments of biological evidence preserved since the 1970s were examined with technology that did not exist when the crimes were committed. Investigative genetic genealogy transformed what had once been an impossible puzzle into a family tree stretching across generations. Detectives were no longer searching for one unknown man. They were tracing bloodlines, comparing historical records, narrowing possibilities until one name refused to disappear. Joseph James D'Angelo? Yet even then, investigators resisted celebration. A family tree lead was not evidence strong enough for an arrest. Surveillance teams quietly watched his daily routine, documenting an elderly retiree living what appeared to be an ordinary suburban life. There were no dramatic escapes, no frantic attempts to flee, no outward signs that the man under observation had become the focus of one of America's most significant cold case investigations. Following established legal procedures, detectives recovered discarded items believed to contain his DNA and submitted them for forensic comparison against biological evidence preserved from decades-old crime scenes. The laboratory results changed the course of criminal justice history. According to prosecutors, the genetic profile matched. More than 40 years after the first known attacks, the unknown predator investigators had pursued across generations finally had a name. On April 24th, 2018, officers arrested Joseph James D'Angelo at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The images that followed stunned the public. The man accused of terrorizing California for years was no longer the athletic figure imagined in countless police sketches, but a 72-year-old retiree whose ordinary appearance underscored one of the most unsettling truths in criminal investigation. Extraordinary crimes are not always committed by people who appear extraordinary. The breakthrough reached far beyond a single arrest. It demonstrated that carefully preserved evidence could outlast the limitations of the era in which it was collected, and that advances in forensic science could revive investigations once considered impossible to solve. Across the United States and beyond, cold case detectives revisited aging evidence lockers with renewed determination, recognizing that every properly preserved sample might one day reveal the truth. The Golden State Killer investigation became more than the resolution of a notorious criminal case. It became a defining example of how persistence, meticulous evidence preservation, and scientific innovation can converge across generations, proving that even after decades of silence, justice may still find its way to the door of someone who believed time had erased every trace. Justice did not arrive with flashing lights alone. It arrived carrying 40 years of unanswered questions, thousands of pages of investigative files, and the voices of victims who had spent decades wondering whether the man responsible would ever face a courtroom. When Joseph James D'Angelo was taken into custody in April 2018, the arrest marked the beginning of an entirely different battle. Detectives had solved one of America's most infamous cold cases, but prosecutors now faced the enormous task of transforming decades of evidence into a case that could withstand the scrutiny of the legal system. The investigation had crossed county lines, involved multiple law enforcement agencies, and stretched across a period when forensic science, investigative techniques, and criminal procedure had changed dramatically. Every report, every preserved piece of evidence, and every witness statement had to be re-examined with extraordinary care. Nothing could be assumed. Every fact had to be documented. Every connection had to be proven. The weight of history rested not only on scientific evidence, but on the integrity of an investigation that had survived generations of detectives, determined not to let the case disappear into forgotten archives. For the survivors, the arrest triggered emotions that were impossible to describe with a single word. Relief mixed with anxiety. Hope collided with memories many had struggled for years to contain. Some had built entirely new lives while carrying invisible scars from the attacks. Others had spent decades wondering whether the unknown offender had ever watched them again from a distance, or whether he had quietly continued living among ordinary families without consequence. The announcement that investigators believed they had identified the Golden State Killer forced many survivors to revisit chapters of their lives they had tried desperately to close. Counselors, victim advocates, and prosecutors worked closely with those affected, recognizing that the legal process itself could reopen emotional wounds. Although the arrest represented a historic breakthrough, it also reminded everyone that justice and healing are not the same. A courtroom can establish accountability, but it cannot erase trauma or restore the years shaped by fear. Investigators continued reviewing evidence long after the arrest. Modern forensic techniques were applied to material collected decades earlier, strengthening connections between crime scenes and refining timelines established during the original investigations. Detectives compared historical reports with newly available information, searching for every detail that could support the prosecution. What impressed many younger investigators was the remarkable discipline of those who had worked the case in the 1970s and 1980s. Despite the technological limitations of that era, they had preserved biological evidence with exceptional care, documented crime scenes thoroughly, and maintained records that would eventually become indispensable. Their work demonstrated an important lesson in criminal investigation. Evidence should always be collected and preserved with the future in mind, because tomorrow's scientific advances may unlock answers that today's technology cannot provide. The public followed every development with intense interest. News organizations revisited neighborhoods that had once lived under constant fear, interviewing retired detectives, former prosecutors, and residents who vividly remembered the long nights when every unfamiliar sound outside a window inspired panic. The story resonated far beyond California because it represented more than the capture of one suspect. It illustrated how determination could survive across generations. Detectives who had begun the investigation as young officers had retired years earlier, yet many remained emotionally connected to the case. Some watched the arrest unfold from their living rooms, realizing that the mystery consuming much of their professional lives had finally reached a turning point they once believed impossible. The case also sparked worldwide discussion about investigative genetic genealogy. Law enforcement agencies studied the methods used in the investigation, while legal scholars and privacy advocates examined the broader implications of applying genealogy databases during criminal investigations. Supporters argued that the technique had provided justice for victims after decades of frustration. Others emphasized the importance of clear legal safeguards and responsible oversight whenever new forensic technologies are introduced. The Golden State Killer investigation became a landmark not only because it identified a suspect, but because it demonstrated how rapidly evolving science can reshape criminal investigations while also raising important questions about ethics, privacy, and the future of forensic evidence. Behind the headlines, prosecutors carefully assembled charges spanning numerous crimes committed across multiple jurisdictions. Coordinating such a complex prosecution required extensive cooperation among district attorneys, investigators, forensic scientists, and victim services. Every decision reflected the extraordinary scale of the case. The passage of time had created obvious challenges. Some witnesses had died. Memories had naturally faded. Certain investigators who first responded to the crime scenes were no longer alive to testify. Yet preserved evidence, detailed documentation, and decades of investigative work continued speaking on behalf of those who could no longer do so themselves. The case became a powerful reminder that meticulous record-keeping is not merely administrative work. It can become the foundation upon which justice is ultimately built. As the legal proceedings advanced, communities once defined by fear began reflecting on how profoundly the crimes had changed everyday life. Residents remembered sleeping with lights on, forming neighborhood watch groups, installing security systems, and questioning every unfamiliar face. Those memories revealed that the impact of violent crime extends far beyond the immediate victims. Entire neighborhoods had altered their routines because of one unidentified offender. The arrest did not erase those experiences, but it offered something many believed they would never receive, an answer grounded in evidence rather than speculation. The Golden State Killer investigation ultimately became one of the defining examples of perseverance in modern criminal justice. It showed that the passage of time does not necessarily weaken the pursuit of truth. Instead, time can preserve opportunities for future investigators equipped with better tools, broader scientific knowledge, and the determination to continue where earlier generations were forced to stop. Long after the headlines faded, the legacy of the case remained visible in cold case units across the world, where aging evidence boxes are now viewed not as forgotten relics, but as potential sources of answers still waiting to emerge. In that sense, the investigation did more than solve one notorious series of crimes. It transformed the way many investigators think about unsolved cases, proving that patience, preservation, and scientific progress can one day bring light to even the darkest chapters of history. The courtroom did not erase the silence that had settled over California decades earlier. It simply gave that silence a place to be heard. Every hearing carried the weight of history, not because of dramatic courtroom confrontations, but because each proceeding represented another step in a journey that had begun in the darkness of suburban neighborhoods more than 40 years before. Prosecutors presented a case built on painstaking investigative work, preserved forensic evidence, and the scientific advances that had finally connected a name to crimes that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved. Unlike the frantic urgency that defined the original investigation, the legal process unfolded with deliberate precision. Every filing, every motion, and every piece of evidence reflected the extraordinary responsibility of ensuring that justice rested on verifiable facts rather than public emotion. For many survivors and victims' families, entering the courtroom meant confronting memories they had spent years trying to bury. Some had never expected to see an arrest in their lifetime. Others had prepared themselves for the possibility that the case would forever remain one of California's most haunting mysteries. Instead, they found themselves sitting only a short distance from the man prosecutors identified as Joseph James D'Angelo. Time had transformed appearances. The decades had aged everyone involved. Detectives who once chased leads through Sacramento neighborhoods now carried gray hair or had long since retired. Survivors who had once been young adults returned as grandparents. Yet the emotional gravity of the crimes remained unchanged. The years had softened neither the pain nor the determination to seek accountability. As the proceedings continued, investigators reflected on how remarkably close the case had come to remaining unsolved forever. Had biological evidence not been preserved according to the standards of the time, later scientific breakthroughs would have had nothing to examine. Had detectives dismissed seemingly insignificant details or destroyed aging evidence during routine record management, the opportunity for identification might have vanished permanently. Instead, generation after generation of investigators treated the case as unfinished rather than abandoned. That philosophy became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. Cold cases do not disappear because time passes. They simply wait for new evidence, new technology, or a new perspective capable of revealing what earlier investigators could not yet see. The significance of the case quickly extended beyond California. Police agencies across the United States reopened evidence rooms filled with boxes that had remained untouched for years. Detectives began reviewing unsolved homicides and sexual assault investigations where biological evidence had been carefully stored. Laboratories expanded efforts to re-examine samples using modern forensic techniques unavailable when the crimes originally occurred. Investigative genetic genealogy, though applied carefully and subject to legal and ethical considerations, demonstrated that long-standing mysteries could sometimes be solved through methods unimaginable only a generation earlier. The Golden State Killer investigation became a case study taught in law enforcement training, forensic science programs, and criminal justice courses, illustrating how persistence and scientific innovation could work together across decades. At the same time, the investigation encouraged broader discussions about the responsibilities accompanying powerful forensic tools. Legal scholars, forensic experts, and privacy advocates examined the growing role of genealogy databases in criminal investigations. Questions emerged regarding transparency, consent, and appropriate safeguards while recognizing the undeniable value such methods had brought to victims' families seeking answers. The case demonstrated both the extraordinary potential of modern science and the importance of maintaining public trust through careful legal oversight. These conversations became part of the investigation's lasting legacy, ensuring that future applications of emerging technology would balance investigative effectiveness with respect for individual rights. Retired detectives often spoke not about the moment of arrest, but about the decades that preceded it. They remembered nights spent knocking on doors, interviewing frightened residents, following leads that ultimately led nowhere, and returning home knowing another family had been devastated while the offender remained unidentified. Many admitted there were moments when frustration threatened to outweigh optimism. Yet few abandoned the belief that the evidence still held answers waiting to be discovered. Their determination influenced younger investigators who inherited the case years later, creating an unbroken chain of commitment that stretched across multiple generations of law enforcement professionals. In many respects, solving the case became less the achievement of one detective than the collective accomplishment of hundreds who refused to let the investigation fade into obscurity. The broader public also learned an important lesson from the case. Criminal investigations rarely resemble the rapid pace of fictional dramas. Real justice often depends upon patience, meticulous documentation, scientific integrity, and collaboration among agencies separated by geography and time. The Golden State Killer investigation highlighted how every carefully labeled evidence envelope, every preserved report, and every accurately documented crime scene could one day become the critical link connecting past crimes to future discoveries. What appeared insignificant in one decade could become decisive in another. Long after the legal proceedings concluded, the neighborhoods once defined by fear gradually reclaimed a sense of normalcy, yet history remained embedded in those quiet streets. Families who had lived through the years of uncertainty remembered checking locks repeatedly before bedtime, organizing neighborhood watches, and wondering whether the unknown offender might already be watching from the darkness beyond the backyard fence. Those memories became part of California's criminal justice history, reminding future generations that the consequences of violent crime extend far beyond individual victims. Entire communities can carry psychological scars long after physical evidence has been collected and police tape removed. The Golden State Killer case ultimately stands as one of the most consequential cold case investigations in modern history, not simply because an offender was identified after more than 4 decades, but because it reshaped how investigators think about unsolved crimes. It proved that evidence preserved with care can outlive the technological limits of its own era, that scientific progress can breathe new life into forgotten investigations, and that perseverance remains one of the most powerful tools available to those seeking the truth. For every detective opening a decades-old evidence box today, the case serves as a quiet reminder that history is not always finished writing its final chapter. Sometimes the answer has been waiting patiently all along, hidden within evidence collected years before anyone possessed the means to fully understand what it contained. The name Joseph James D'Angelo had once meant nothing to the investigators who spent decades searching for the man behind California's most terrifying cold case. But after his arrest, the focus of the investigation changed forever. The mystery was no longer about who was hiding in the darkness. It became a deeper question that haunted survivors, detectives, and the public alike. How could someone accused of committing years of carefully planned crimes disappear into ordinary life for more than 4 decades? For many people watching the case unfold, the most disturbing detail was not only the length of time that had passed, but the normal appearance of the man investigators had identified. The image of a dangerous criminal had been replaced by the image of an aging man living quietly in a suburban neighborhood. The contrast created shock across the country. It forced many to confront an unsettling reality of criminal investigations. The people responsible for extraordinary crimes do not always look extraordinary. Sometimes they blend into the background. Sometimes they become the person nobody suspects. As prosecutors prepared their case, investigators returned once again to the evidence that had survived the passage of time. The foundation of the case was not rumor, speculation, or public suspicion. It was the physical evidence collected from crime scenes decades earlier. Biological samples preserved from the original investigations became the bridge between the past and the present. Every laboratory result, Every forensic comparison and every documented connection strengthened the case that the unidentified offender who had terrorized communities in California had finally been identified. The investigation also revealed the importance of cooperation across generations of law enforcement. Many of the detectives who first responded to the crimes had long since retired. Some had never expected to see the conclusion of the case during their lifetimes. Yet their early work remained essential. The interviews they conducted, the reports they wrote, and the evidence they protected created a foundation that future investigators could build upon decades later. For survivors, the legal process brought a complicated mixture of emotions. The arrest answered one question that had remained open for years, but it also reopened memories that had never completely disappeared. Many victims had spent decades rebuilding their lives while carrying the consequences of what happened to them. The courtroom became a place where those experiences were finally recognized publicly. Their voices, once overshadowed by the mystery of an unknown attacker, became central to the pursuit of justice. The prosecution presented a case that reflected the enormous scope of the crimes attributed to D'Angelo. The charges involved multiple jurisdictions and years of investigation. Prosecutors faced the challenge of explaining not only individual crimes but the broader pattern that connected them. They relied on forensic evidence, investigative records, and testimony to demonstrate how separate incidents across California were linked to one offender. The case also changed how the world viewed cold case investigations for decades. Unresolved cases were often considered frozen in time, limited by the technology available when they occurred. The Golden State Killer investigation challenged that belief. It showed that a case could remain active even when decades had passed. Evidence collected by one generation could become the breakthrough discovered by another. But the investigation also raised difficult conversations about the future of forensic science. The same technology that helped identify D'Angelo created new debates about privacy, genetic databases, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting personal information. The case became a symbol of both the power and responsibility of modern science. It demonstrated that technology could bring answers to victims' families while also requiring careful consideration about how those tools should be used. Behind every headline and every courtroom appearance were the communities that had lived through years of fear. Neighborhoods once filled with suspicion slowly began to move forward. The streets where residents had once checked locks repeatedly before going to sleep became ordinary places again. Yet the memories remained. The fear experienced by thousands of people during those years became part of the history of California and one of the most significant criminal investigations in American history. The Golden State Killer case was never only about the capture of one man. It was about time, persistence, and the belief that unanswered questions still deserve answers. It was about investigators who refused to close the files permanently, scientists who developed methods that transformed old evidence into new possibilities, and survivors who carried the weight of the past while waiting for justice. More than 40 years after the first crimes shocked California communities, the investigation finally reached a moment that many once believed impossible. The shadow that had followed generations of families had a name. The evidence that had remained silent for decades had finally spoken. And the case that had become a symbol of mystery and frustration became a powerful reminder that even the longest cold cases can eventually find their way toward the truth. Dial apartiem. Golden State Killer Theo Fong CCH, voice over in Tip Nimich K. Chine. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo closed one chapter of the Golden State Killer investigation, but it opened another. The long and painful journey of understanding what had happened, who had been affected, and how a criminal case that began in the 1970s had transformed the future of modern forensic science. For decades, the victims had lived with uncertainty. They had carried memories that never disappeared, questions that were never answered, and the heavy knowledge that the person responsible might never be found. Then, after more than 40 years of silence, the impossible happened. The unknown offender finally had a name. The man who had once existed only through descriptions, sketches, and evidence collected at crime scenes was now standing before the justice system. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Around the world, people followed the case because it represented something larger than one criminal investigation. It was a story about time itself, a story about whether justice could survive decades of waiting. Many cold cases fade from public attention as years pass. Investigators retire. Witnesses move away. Records become harder to locate. Memories become less precise. But the Golden State Killer investigation proved that some cases are never truly forgotten. They remain alive inside evidence rooms, inside investigative files, and inside the determination of those who refuse to accept that an unanswered question must remain unanswered forever. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they faced the enormous responsibility of presenting a case that stretched across generations. They needed to explain how crimes committed decades earlier were connected, how evidence collected long ago remained reliable, and how modern forensic methods had transformed an impossible investigation into a solvable one. The challenge was not simply identifying Joseph James D'Angelo. The challenge was showing the full picture, the pattern of crimes, the investigative journey, and the impact left behind on countless victims and communities. The courtroom became a place where history was reconstructed piece by piece. Evidence that had once sat quietly in storage became central to the proceedings. Investigators described the years of work required to connect separate investigations into one larger picture. The scientific breakthroughs received worldwide attention, but behind the technology were years of traditional police work. Interviews, reports, crime scene documentation, and cooperation between agencies all played essential roles. DNA may have provided the final connection, but the path to that moment had been built by thousands of decisions made by investigators over decades. For survivors, the legal process carried a different meaning. They were not simply witnesses in a criminal case. They were the people whose lives had been permanently changed. Some had spent years wondering whether anyone would ever understand what they experienced. Some had watched other cold cases receive attention while their own remained unresolved. The identification of D'Angelo gave them something that had been missing for decades: recognition that what happened to them mattered and that their stories had not been forgotten. The case also revealed the psychological complexity of crimes that remain unsolved for many years. The passage of time can create a false sense of distance, as if decades somehow reduce the seriousness of what occurred. But for victims, time does not erase trauma. A crime committed 40 years earlier can remain emotionally present every day. The investigation's conclusion demonstrated that justice is not limited by a calendar. The consequences of criminal actions continue long after headlines disappear. The Golden State Killer investigation became a defining example of how modern technology could transform criminal justice. Before this case, many investigators wondered whether genetic genealogy would become a major tool in solving cold cases. Afterward, agencies across the country began examining whether previously unsolved investigations could benefit from similar approaches. Evidence once considered too old was reconsidered. Cases once considered impossible were reopened. Families who had waited decades began receiving renewed hope. However, the breakthrough also introduced important questions. The power of genetic technology created discussions about privacy, consent, and the responsibilities of investigators using these methods. Solving crimes and protecting individual rights became part of the same conversation. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated that science could provide extraordinary answers, but it also showed that every powerful tool requires careful rules and responsible use. Beyond the courtroom, the legacy of the case continued through the investigators who dedicated years of their lives to finding the truth. Some had worked the original crimes. Others inherited the case decades later. Different generations of detectives contributed different pieces of the puzzle. Their work proved that investigations are not always completed by the same people who begin them. Sometimes justice depends on one generation preserving the evidence so another generation can finally discover the answer. The story of Joseph James DeAngelo remains one of the most significant examples of a cold case transformed by persistence and science. It changed how law enforcement agencies view old evidence. It changed how victims and families view the possibility of answers after decades of uncertainty. And it changed public understanding of what is possible when technology meets determination. For years, the Golden State Killer was a symbol of fear and mystery, but after the investigation reached its conclusion, the story became something else. It became a symbol of patience, a reminder that evidence can survive, that investigators can continue searching. That time does not always protect those who commit crimes. In the quiet evidence rooms where old files waited for decades, the truth had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the moment when science, dedication, and perseverance finally came together to reveal it. The story of the Golden State Killer was never only about the moment of arrest. It was about everything that came before it and everything that followed afterward. Behind the headlines announcing Joseph James DeAngelo's capture was a much larger story of survivors searching for answers, investigators fighting against time, and a justice system attempting to bring closure to a case that had remained open for more than 4 decades. The arrest solved the mystery of identity, but it did not erase the years of fear, the emotional wounds, or the memories carried by those who had lived through one of California's most disturbing criminal investigations. When Joseph James DeAngelo entered the legal system, the world saw a man who appeared dramatically different from the image created by decades of investigation. The unknown offender had once existed in the public imagination as a figure moving through darkness, a person whose presence was defined by fear and uncertainty. Now that figure had become an elderly defendant sitting in court. The contrast was unsettling. For many observers, it raised a difficult question. How could someone accused of such crimes maintain an ordinary appearance for so long while an entire state searched for answers? Investigators and prosecutors understood that the case could not be built on emotion alone. The passage of time created unique challenges. Some evidence had to be carefully explained. Some witnesses had aged. Some original investigators were no longer available. Yet the strength of the case came from the fact that it had been preserved across generations. The physical evidence collected decades earlier remained a crucial link between past and present. Scientific advancement had not replaced traditional police work. Instead, it had completed it. The courtroom proceedings became a powerful reminder that criminal investigations are built slowly. The public often sees only the final moment, the arrest, the announcement, the press conference, but behind those moments are years of unseen work. Detectives reviewed thousands of pages of reports. Analysts examined forensic material. Prosecutors studied historical records. Victim advocates prepared to support those who would finally confront the person accused of changing their lives forever. For survivors, the legal process represented a moment they had once believed might never happen. Some had spent decades wondering whether the person responsible would ever be identified. Others had accepted the possibility that the case might remain unsolved forever. The announcement of DeAngelo's arrest changed that reality overnight. But justice brought complicated emotions. The discovery of the offender's identity could provide answers, but it could not return the years lost to fear or remove the memories created by trauma. The voices of survivors became one of the most important parts of the final chapter of the case. Their experiences showed that the impact of crime extends far beyond police reports and courtroom evidence. Each attack affected families, relationships, communities, and entire neighborhoods. The fear created by the offender changed how people lived their daily lives. Simple routines, walking outside at night, leaving doors unlocked, trusting familiar surroundings, were transformed by anxiety. The prosecution also highlighted the scale of the investigation. The crimes attributed to DeAngelo occurred across multiple California counties over many years. Connecting those separate cases required cooperation among different law enforcement agencies that had originally investigated individual incidents. The eventual resolution demonstrated the importance of sharing information and recognizing patterns across jurisdictions. A single crime scene may reveal only part of the truth. Multiple investigations combined together can reveal an entirely different picture. One of the most significant outcomes of the case was the attention it brought to cold case investigations worldwide. Before the identification of D'Angelo, many families believed that decades-old cases had little chance of being solved. The Golden State Killer investigation changed that perception. It demonstrated that old evidence could still hold value and that scientific progress could transform forgotten files into active investigations once again. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing unresolved cases with new optimism. Evidence collected decades earlier was reconsidered. Investigators looked for biological material that might be suitable for modern analysis. Advances in forensic technology created possibilities that earlier generations could never have imagined. The lesson was clear. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the solution depends on waiting for the right technology to catch up with the evidence. At the same time, the case encouraged important conversations about the future of genetic investigation. The same methods that helped identify D'Angelo also raised questions about privacy and ethical responsibility. As law enforcement agencies explored new forensic tools, society faced the challenge of balancing public safety with individual rights. The Golden State Killer investigation became a landmark example of both the power and complexity of modern science. The legacy of the case was not measured only by one conviction or one courtroom decision. Its impact reached into police departments, forensic laboratories, and communities around the world. It changed expectations about what could be achieved in investigations that had remained unresolved for decades. It gave hope to families who had long waited for answers. And it demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence even when a solution seems impossible. More than 40 years after the first crimes connected to the Golden State Killer shocked California, the investigation reached a conclusion that few believed they would ever witness. A name replaced a mystery, evidence replaced uncertainty, and a case once defined by unanswered questions became a symbol of perseverance and scientific progress. The story of the Golden State Killer remains a reminder that time does not always protect those who commit crimes. Evidence can survive. Investigators can continue searching, and even after decades of silence, the truth can still emerge. Tip TV Part Golden State Killer. Theo Fong Sich voice over in NH Datran CC's Kin S C Genjun. The final chapter of the Golden State Killer investigation was not written in a single moment. It was created through decades of persistence, thousands of hours of investigative work, and the determination of people who refused to allow time to erase the truth. When Joseph James D'Angelo's name became known to the world, many believed the greatest mystery had already been solved. The unknown offender had finally been identified. But behind that historic breakthrough remained another story. The story of justice, accountability, and the lasting impact of a case that changed the way the world viewed cold case investigations. For the investigators who had followed the case for years, the arrest was both an ending and a beginning. The search for an unidentified suspect was over, but proving the case required careful preparation. Decades had passed since the original crimes. The world had changed. Technology had advanced. Communities had moved forward, but the responsibility remained the same: to present the evidence clearly and ensure that the voices of those affected were finally heard. The legal process revealed the extraordinary timeline behind the investigation. Crimes that began in an era before modern DNA analysis were eventually connected through technology that investigators from the 1970s could never have imagined. The evidence collected during those early years had survived long enough to become the foundation of a historic breakthrough. It was a powerful reminder that every piece of evidence matters, even when the answer seems impossibly far away. The prosecution's case reflected the complexity of crimes that crossed multiple jurisdictions and involved numerous victims. Investigators had to organize decades of information into a clear narrative. Each piece of evidence had to show its place in the larger picture. Each connection had to be supported by facts. The process required cooperation between agencies, forensic experts, prosecutors, and investigators who had dedicated years to understanding the case. For survivors, the courtroom represented something far greater than a legal proceeding. It was a place where experiences that had remained private for decades were finally acknowledged. Many survivors had lived through years of uncertainty, never knowing whether the person responsible would ever face consequences. The identification of D'Angelo provided an answer that had once seemed impossible. It confirmed that their experiences had not been forgotten and that the investigation had never truly ended. The emotional impact of the case extended beyond those directly involved. Entire communities remembered the fear that had spread through California neighborhoods decades earlier. Residents recalled nights when simple sounds outside their homes created panic. They remembered checking doors repeatedly, watching unfamiliar vehicles, and changing daily routines because of an invisible threat. The crimes had affected not only individuals, but the collective sense of safety within communities. The Golden State Killer investigation also became a turning point in the history of forensic science. Before this case, many investigators wondered how far genetic genealogy could go in solving old crimes. The identification of D'Angelo demonstrated that decades-old evidence could become valuable again when combined with new scientific methods. It inspired investigators around the world to reconsider cases that had remained unresolved for years. However, the breakthrough also brought new discussions about the responsibility that comes with powerful technology. Genetic investigation created possibilities that once seemed impossible, but it also required careful consideration of privacy and legal protections. The case became part of a larger conversation about how society should use scientific tools that can reveal hidden connections between individuals and their relatives. Beyond the technology, the investigation's greatest lesson was patience. The people who preserved evidence decades earlier could not know exactly how future science would use it. They simply understood that protecting the integrity of the evidence mattered. Their careful work created an opportunity for future investigators to succeed where previous generations had reached the limits of their available tools. The story of the Golden State Killer also changed the relationship between law enforcement and families waiting for answers. For many relatives of victims in other cold cases, the investigation created renewed hope. It showed that unresolved does not mean forgotten. A case may remain silent for years, but silence does not mean the truth has disappeared. Joseph James D'Angelo's conviction and sentencing marked accountability for crimes that had haunted California for generations. But the significance of the case extended beyond the punishment of one individual. It became a symbol of what can happen when evidence, determination, and technology come together. It showed that justice can move slowly, but it can still arrive. The Golden State Killer case remains one of the most remarkable examples of modern criminal investigation. It began with frightened communities, overwhelmed detectives, and a suspect who seemed impossible to find. It ended with a scientific breakthrough that changed the future of cold case investigations forever. For more than 40 years, the answer had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when science could finally reveal what investigators had searched for all along. The evidence had survived, the investigation had endured, and after decades of uncertainty, the truth finally stepped out of the shadows. The name Golden State Killer became known around the world as a symbol of fear, mystery, and a crime that seemed impossible to solve. But after the arrest and conviction of Joseph James D'Angelo, the focus of the story shifted. The question was no longer only about who committed the crimes. It became a deeper examination of how a case could remain unsolved for so long, how evidence could survive across generations, and how a single investigation could transform the future of criminal justice. For decades, the case represented the limits of traditional investigation. Detectives had followed leads, interviewed witnesses, examined physical evidence, and searched through countless possibilities. They had built timelines, studied patterns, and compared details across multiple jurisdictions. Yet the offender remained unidentified. The investigation existed in a difficult space between hope and uncertainty. Every new technology brought the possibility of answers, but every passing year created the fear that the opportunity might disappear forever. The eventual breakthrough changed the way law enforcement viewed old cases. The investigation demonstrated that time was not always the enemy. In some situations, time allowed evidence to wait for the right scientific advancement. The biological material collected decades earlier had become more valuable as technology evolved. What investigators once considered important evidence became something far more powerful years later: a direct connection between historical crimes and a living suspect. The Golden State Killer investigation also highlighted the importance of cooperation. The original crimes involved different locations and different law enforcement agencies. At first, many investigators worked within their own jurisdictions, focused on incidents occurring in their own communities. Over time, patterns became clearer, and information sharing helped create a larger understanding of the offender's behavior. The eventual solution showed that criminal investigations are often strongest when agencies combine knowledge rather than working separately. Behind the scientific breakthrough were countless hours of traditional detective work. Modern forensic methods attracted worldwide attention, but technology alone did not solve the case. Investigators still needed to understand the evidence, interpret the history of the crimes, and build a complete picture of the offender. The genetic information provided a path, but human investigation turned that path into a case. The victims remained at the center of that journey. Their experiences shaped every stage of the investigation. For many survivors, the passage of decades did not lessen the impact of what happened. They had carried memories that remained vivid despite the years that passed. The resolution of the case gave them recognition and accountability, but it also reminded the world that behind every criminal statistic are real people whose lives were permanently changed. The sentencing of Joseph James D'Angelo marked a moment of accountability, but it also created an opportunity to reflect on the broader meaning of justice. A conviction can answer questions about responsibility, yet it cannot completely undo the damage caused by years of fear and trauma. For survivors and families, justice was not only about punishment, it was also about having their stories acknowledged and knowing that the person responsible could no longer hide behind anonymity. The case also influenced how investigators approached future cold cases. Evidence rooms across the country were reconsidered. Old files were reopened. Previously unsolved crimes received renewed attention as law enforcement agencies explored whether modern forensic techniques could provide answers. Families who had waited years for information found new hope that their cases might not be forgotten. However, the legacy of the Golden State Killer investigation was not without challenges. The use of genetic genealogy created important discussions about privacy, consent, and the future of investigative technology. The ability to identify suspects through family connections represented a powerful advancement, but it also required careful consideration about how such methods should be used responsibly. The case became part of a broader conversation about the relationship between science, law enforcement, and personal privacy. The investigation also changed public understanding of what a cold case really means. Many people once viewed old investigations as mysteries permanently trapped in the past. The Golden State Killer case challenged that belief. It showed that unanswered questions can remain active beneath the surface, waiting for a new perspective or a new tool. A case that appears frozen may still contain evidence capable of revealing the truth. Perhaps the most lasting lesson from the investigation was the importance of never underestimating the value of careful police work. The detectives who collected evidence decades earlier could not predict how future technology would use it. They did not know that the samples they preserved would eventually become part of a historic breakthrough. They simply followed the principles of good investigation. Document everything, protect evidence, and continue searching for answers. The story of Joseph James D'Angelo became one of the clearest examples of how the past and present can meet through science. The crimes belonged to another era. The evidence came from another generation. The technology belonged to the modern world. Together, they created a connection that crossed more than 40 years. The Golden State Killer case changed from a story of fear into a story of perseverance. It showed that victims and families could still find answers even after decades of uncertainty. It showed investigators that old cases could still hold new possibilities. And it showed the world that justice does not always arrive quickly, but it can arrive when dedication and innovation come together. In the end, the most powerful message of the case was not simply that a criminal was found. It was that the truth survived, hidden inside evidence collected long ago, preserved through years of uncertainty, was the information needed to finally reveal what happened. The investigation endured because people refused to stop searching. Then, after decades of silence, the evidence finally spoke. Tip 2-part My High Golden State Killer Theo Fong Sich voice over in NHD Transccs as Kin Lesh S. C. Jinyan. The story of the Golden State Killer did not end when the courtroom doors closed. In many ways, that was only the beginning of a much larger conversation about justice, memory, and the power of modern forensic science. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo answered the question that had haunted investigators for decades: who was the man behind the crimes? But the resolution of the case opened another chapter, one focused on the people who had carried the weight of uncertainty for so many years and the lessons that would influence criminal investigations around the world. For the survivors, the conclusion of the case represented a moment they once believed might never arrive. Decades had passed since the nights that changed their lives forever. They had grown older. Their families had changed. The world around them had transformed. Yet the memories remained. The fear, the confusion, and the emotional scars created by those crimes did not disappear simply because time moved forward. The identification of D'Angelo did not erase the past, but it provided something that had been missing for years: confirmation that the truth had finally been recognized. The courage of survivors became one of the defining elements of the case. Their willingness to cooperate with investigators, revisit painful memories, and participate in legal proceedings demonstrated extraordinary strength. Without their testimony and persistence, the story of the Golden State Killer would have been incomplete. Behind every piece of evidence and every investigative breakthrough were real people who had spent decades waiting for answers. The investigation also changed the way society viewed cold cases. For many years, unresolved crimes were often associated with frustration and uncertainty. Families sometimes feared that their loved ones' cases would disappear into forgotten files. A Golden State Killer investigation challenged that belief. It proved that time does not always destroy the possibility of justice. Evidence preserved properly can survive. Investigators can continue searching. Technology can create opportunities that earlier generations never had. One of the most important lessons from the case was the value of evidence preservation. When the original investigators collected biological evidence decades earlier, they could not have predicted how future technology would transform criminal investigations. DNA analysis in the 1970s and 1980s was nothing like the advanced methods available today. Yet because those samples were protected and maintained, they remained available when science finally reached a point where they could reveal their secrets. The case became a powerful example for law enforcement agencies around the world. Cold case investigators began looking again at evidence that had once seemed limited. Old files were reviewed with new perspectives. Advances in DNA technology encouraged departments to reconsider investigations that had remained unresolved for years. The message was clear: an unsolved case is not necessarily an impossible case. However, the success of genetic genealogy also created new responsibilities. The technology that helped identify D'Angelo introduced complex questions about privacy and ethics. Investigators, lawmakers, and scientists began discussing how these powerful tools should be used in future investigations. The ability to trace genetic connections could bring justice to victims, but it also required careful guidelines to protect personal information and maintain public trust. The Golden State Killer case became a turning point because it represented both possibility and responsibility. It showed what science could accomplish when combined with determination, but it also reminded society that every new investigative tool must be handled carefully. The future of forensic science would depend not only on technological progress, but also on thoughtful decisions about how that technology should serve justice. Beyond the science and the courtroom, the case left a lasting impression on the communities affected by the crimes. Places that had once been defined by fear slowly returned to normal life. Streets that had once felt unsafe became ordinary again. Families continued forward. New generations grew up without experiencing the same uncertainty that had shaped the lives of those who lived through the original investigation. Yet the memory of what happened remained. The Golden State Killer case became part of California's history, not only because of the crimes themselves, but because of the extraordinary effort required to solve them. It represented the dedication of investigators who refused to abandon the search, scientists who developed new methods, and survivors who continued carrying their stories forward. The investigation also changed the public perception of justice. Many people imagine justice as something immediate, a quick investigation, an arrest, and a verdict. The Golden State Killer case revealed a different reality. Sometimes justice is a process measured not in days or months, but in decades. Sometimes it requires one generation to begin the search and another generation to finish it. More than 40 years separated the first crimes from the moment Joseph James DeAngelo was identified. During that time, countless people contributed to the investigation in ways that may never receive worldwide attention. Detectives who gathered evidence, analysts who reviewed reports, scientists who advanced forensic methods, victims who refused to let their experiences be forgotten. Together, they created a chain of determination that eventually led to the truth. The Golden State Killer case remains one of the most significant examples of modern criminal investigation because it represents something larger than a single arrest. It represents the idea that evidence has a voice, even when it must wait decades to be heard. It represents the belief that unanswered questions deserve answers. And it represents the possibility that even the darkest mysteries can eventually be brought into the light. For years, the offender believed time had created distance between himself and the crimes investigators were trying to solve. But time did something unexpected. It allowed science to advance. It allowed investigators to develop new strategies. And it allowed the truth to remain preserved until the moment it could finally emerge. The silence lasted for decades. The search continued across generations. And in the end, the evidence that had waited patiently through history delivered the answer everyone had been searching for. The Golden State Killer case became more than the story of a criminal investigation. It became a symbol of time, persistence, and the extraordinary ability of modern science to uncover truths hidden for decades. After Joseph James DeAngelo was identified and convicted, the world looked back at the investigation not only to understand how the offender was finally caught, but also to understand why the case had remained unsolved for so long. The answer was found in the combination of human determination and technological evolution. A mystery that had survived generations was finally broken apart piece by piece. For the investigators who had carried the case throughout the years, the resolution represented a moment of reflection. Many had spent their careers following leads that ended without answers. They had searched through reports, interviewed witnesses, examined evidence, and returned repeatedly to the same unanswered questions. The identity of the offender remained hidden despite decades of effort. Yet those investigators understood something important. A case is not truly lost as long as evidence remains and someone continues searching. The breakthrough involving investigative genetic genealogy changed the future of criminal investigations. Before this case, many people viewed DNA as a tool that could only identify suspects already connected to law enforcement databases. The Golden State Killer investigation expanded that understanding. It showed that genetic relationships could provide investigative pathways even when the offender had never been identified through traditional methods. The process required extraordinary patience. Investigators and genealogists did not simply enter information and receive an instant answer. They followed complex family connections, examined historical records, and carefully narrowed possibilities. Every step required verification. Every possibility had to be tested. The process demonstrated that even the most advanced technology still depends on human analysis and careful reasoning. The identification of D'Angelo also changed public understanding of long-term investigations. For decades, many believed that a person who avoided capture for 40 years had somehow escaped justice permanently. The case proved otherwise. Time may slow an investigation, but it does not always end it. Evidence collected in one era can become decisive in another. A question that seems impossible today may have a solution tomorrow. The impact of the case reached far beyond California. Law enforcement agencies around the world studied the investigation as a model for examining unresolved crimes. Cold case units began exploring whether older evidence could be reconsidered using modern methods. Families who had spent years waiting for answers found renewed hope. The message was powerful. Every preserved piece of evidence represents a possibility. But the investigation also highlighted the emotional reality behind cold cases. Behind every file number was a person. Behind every crime scene photograph was a family affected by loss, fear, or trauma. The passage of time did not erase the consequences experienced by victims. Their stories became a reminder that solving a case is not simply about identifying an offender. It is about recognizing the lives changed by the crime and acknowledging the importance of their experiences. The Golden State Killer investigation also demonstrated the importance of collaboration. No single person solved the case. It was the result of multiple generations of investigators, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and professionals who contributed different pieces of knowledge. Some worked during the original crimes. Others entered the investigation decades later. Together, they created a continuous chain of effort that survived changes in technology, personnel, and time. The case also forced society to consider the future of forensic science. As genetic technology becomes more advanced, new opportunities emerge, but so do new responsibilities. The ability to uncover identities through genetic connections has enormous potential. Yet it must be balanced with ethical considerations. The Golden State Killer investigation became part of an ongoing discussion about how science should be used in the pursuit of justice. For the communities affected by the crimes, the resolution brought a complicated form of closure. The fear that had once dominated neighborhoods slowly became part of history. Residents who had lived through those years remembered the anxiety that shaped their daily routines. They remembered locked doors, nighttime concerns, and the feeling that danger could appear anywhere. The arrest did not erase those memories, but it changed the meaning of them. The unknown threat had finally become known. The case also left a lasting message for future generations of investigators. Persistence matters. Evidence matters. Patience matters. Many of the people who worked on the original investigation never saw the final result. They trusted that the evidence they collected might someday help reveal the truth. That trust became one of the strongest foundations of the investigation. The Golden State Killer case remains one of the most remarkable examples of how justice can survive the passage of time. It began during an era when forensic science had limited tools and ended during an era when genetic technology could uncover connections across generations. The distance between those two moments represents the incredible transformation of criminal investigation. Yet the most powerful part of the story is not the technology itself. It is the determination behind it. Science provided the opportunity, but people created the possibility. Investigators preserved evidence. Survivors continued speaking. His scientists developed new methods. Prosecutors built the case. Each contribution became part of a larger effort to answer a question that had remained unanswered for decades. The Golden State Killer investigation changed history because it proved that time does not always belong to those who commit crimes. Sometimes time works in favor of justice. Every year that passed brought new scientific discoveries. Every decade created new investigative possibilities. What once seemed like an unsolvable mystery became a case study in perseverance and innovation. The story of Joseph James D'Angelo will always be remembered as one of the most significant cold case investigations ever solved. But the deeper legacy belongs to everyone who refused to accept that the truth was gone. They proved that even after decades of silence, evidence can still speak, and justice can still find its way forward. The final chapter of the Golden State Killer investigation is not only about the capture of Joseph James D'Angelo, it is about the lasting impact of a case that changed the way the world understands justice, forensic science, and the pursuit of truth. For more than 40 years, the crimes connected to the Golden State Killer represented one of the most haunting mysteries in American criminal history. The investigation began in an era when detectives relied on determination, interviews, and physical evidence collected through traditional methods. It ended in a modern age where genetic technology could reach back through decades and reveal an identity that had remained hidden for generations. The resolution of the case proved that an investigation does not always end when the trail goes cold. Sometimes the trail simply waits for the right moment. The evidence collected from crime scenes in the 1970s and 1980s survived because investigators understood its importance. They preserved what they could, documented what they found, and created a foundation that future generations would eventually use. They could not predict the technology that would one day analyze that evidence. They could only trust that protecting the truth mattered. The story of the Golden State Killer became a powerful reminder that every cold case represents real people waiting for answers. Behind the statistics and headlines were survivors whose lives were permanently changed. They carried memories that remained long after the investigation disappeared from daily news coverage. They experienced fear, uncertainty, and emotional pain that continued across decades. When Joseph James D'Angelo was identified, the world focused on the scientific breakthrough, but the heart of the case remained the people who had waited so long to be heard. The legal conclusion of the case brought accountability, but it also created a moment of reflection. Justice could finally acknowledge what victims had endured. Their experiences were no longer connected only to an unknown suspect. They were connected to a person held responsible in a court of law. The passage of time had not erased what happened. Instead, it demonstrated that serious crimes remain significant regardless of how many years pass. The impact of the investigation reached far beyond the courtroom. Around the world, law enforcement agencies studied the methods used to identify D'Angelo. The case became one of the most recognized examples of investigative genetic genealogy, showing how new technology could transform unresolved investigations. Evidence once considered too old could become valuable again. Cases once considered impossible could be reopened with renewed hope. But perhaps the greatest lesson of the Golden State Killer case was the importance of patience. Modern audiences often expect immediate answers. Crime stories are frequently presented as problems solved within hours or days. The reality of this investigation was very different. It required decades of persistence. It required investigators to continue searching even when success seemed unlikely. It required survivors to continue carrying their stories even when they did not know whether justice would ever arrive. The case also changed the relationship between science and criminal investigation. DNA technology became more than a tool for identifying suspects. It became a bridge between past and present. It connected investigators from different generations and allowed evidence collected decades earlier to become meaningful in a new era. The Golden State Killer investigation showed that science can extend the reach of justice far beyond the limitations of its original time period. At the same time, the case created important discussions about responsibility and ethics. As genetic investigative techniques became more widely known, questions emerged about privacy, consent, and appropriate use. The same technology that helped solve a devastating crime also required society to consider how such powerful methods should be managed. The future of forensic science would depend not only on what technology can do, but on how carefully it is used. For the detectives involved, the conclusion of the case represented more than professional success. It represented respect for the victims and for the investigators who had worked before them. Some detectives spent entire careers connected to the search. Others inherited the investigation years later. Each person contributed a small piece to a much larger puzzle. The final answer came because generations of investigators continued moving forward. The story also became a message of hope for families connected to other unsolved cases. Across the world, people who had spent years waiting for answers saw the Golden State Killer investigation as proof that impossible does not always mean hopeless. Technology continues to evolve. Evidence continues to reveal new information, and cases that appear forgotten may still contain the clues needed for resolution. More than 4 decades separated the beginning of the investigation from its conclusion. During that time, neighborhoods changed, detectives retired, and technology transformed the entire field of forensic science. Yet one thing remained constant: the search for truth. The investigation survived because people believed that the victims deserved answers and that the evidence deserved a chance to speak. The Golden State Killer case will always be remembered as a story of darkness, but it will also be remembered as a story of perseverance. It showed the devastating impact of crime, but it also showed the strength of those who continued fighting for justice. It demonstrated the importance of science, the value of careful investigation, and the power of refusing to give up. In the end, the greatest legacy of the case was not simply that Joseph James Dangelo was identified. It was that a message was sent to investigators, victims, and communities everywhere. Time does not guarantee that the truth will remain hidden. Evidence can survive. Questions can be answered. And even after decades of silence, justice can still find a way forward. The story that began with fear in California neighborhoods became a landmark in criminal history. A cold case that once seemed impossible became proof that persistence and innovation can overcome even the greatest obstacles. The evidence waited. The investigators continued searching. And after 42 years, the truth finally emerged from the shadows.